as a church through the season of Lent that we've embraced to prepare our hearts, to prepare our souls for the resurrection. The road to resurrection always leads through death. The road to Easter always leads through Good Friday. And so as a church, we've been working at hearing some stories out of Scripture about redemption. Redemption is this churchy kind of word that in our culture doesn't really have a whole lot of meaning, and so we associate, and I think that's good, I know my church wants that, but the stories that God has given us about redemption begins to really clear up what that word is and why God's people have always been excited about redemption. Redemption is when a patriarch in Israel's culture, the head of father or grandfather of the clan, when the patriarch puts his own resources on the line to ransom a family member who's on the margins of life by poverty or seized by an enemy against which he has no defense, or maybe even just left to the side of life as a result of their own irresponsible choices. Whatever brought the individual outside of the father's household is indifferent to the patriarch saying, I need to go and redeem and bring them back into the family clan. Redemption was that means by which the lost family member was brought back into the place of security within that kinship circle, what the Hebrew is the Beit Ab, the father's household. And so we've seen the story of Abraham putting himself and 318 men on the line to go storm the enemy to rescue his nephew Lot. Followed by God himself taking that role of Redeemer. And hundreds of times throughout Scripture identifying himself as, I am Yahweh, who has brought you up out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. That I am Yahweh, my identity will always be a Redeemer who's brought my son Israel home to the Promised Land. And last week, we had the story of Ruth and her mother-in-law and a kinsman redeemer, Boaz. And the end of that story is awesome as that lineage begins to point to Boaz is a redeemer for sure. But there's one greater in the line of King David who will come to redeem his people. And today, we get really personal. The story of redemption this morning is as personal as it can get, because that familial relationship that we'll have before us, redemption is going to be lived out between a husband and a wife, not just any, but between a prophet and a prostitute. So I want to invite you, work your way to Hosea 1, whether it's a real touchy-feely Bible or your phone, find your way to Hosea chapter 1. When you find the bigger books of Isaiah, Ezekiel, it's followed by Daniel, and right after that you'll find Hosea. And I just want to start by saying Hosea's story is one that will drive deep for some of us. For some of us, you've been hurt by betrayal. Whenever a story, a song on the radio comes up about betrayal, adultery, chasing after others, it's not just a theory for you. It's not just a song. It's something that stirs up deep pain because it's been your experience, or maybe you've been the one that has made that choice, and it's changed your life forever. And if you could give anything to go back and change it, you would, but you can't. And I just want to let you know, sometimes, if that's your story this morning, if betrayal is part of your pain, I want to encourage you with this. I'm not unaware of your lives, but sometimes that place of personal pain and the most sensitive areas of life are the places that God chooses to do some amazing work. When we have nothing to grab onto with our own strength, when we feel completely weak and completely devastated, those are some moments of great grace and even great redemption. And I'm praying that for you today. Hosea chapter 1, verse 1. The word of the Lord that came to Hosea, son of Berai, during the reigns of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah, during the reign of Jeroboam, son of Jehoash, king of Israel. We are now in the phase of Israel where there's a split kingdom. Israel was only united for a few kings. Saul, but then he was dethroned, then you had David, David's son Solomon, and after Solomon, things begin to rip apart. The northern kingdom, and this is where it gets confusing for me and for all of us, the northern kingdom is called Israel. The whole nation is called Israel. And so sometimes you see those words and you're like, wait, I thought that was Israel, but then Judah gets thrown in and you're like, wait, where's Judah? The way that the Bible works it out is that divided kingdom, the northern part, the Bible calls Israel. The southern part, the Bible calls Judah. And so now we have two sets of kings in these two nations. And some of the history in the Bible, it's going from the northern kingdom and their kings, and then you look at the southern kingdom and their kings, and then you're back to the north and their kings. Hosea is in that northern kingdom. He's in the part that the Bible still calls Israel. Hosea is a prophet in the north, and as a prophet, he is the local holy man. And there's this interesting thing about prophets in the Old Testament. Some of them had wealth, some of them didn't. Hosea is probably middle-class prophet somewhere. He has some resources, but not a ton. But a prophet, in our minds, when I say there's three offices in the nation, there's some songs. In fact, there's a band, right? Prophet, priest, king. Those are the three offices in Israel. In our minds, say, the king is all-powerful and the king is amazing. And there are some amazing kings in Israel's history, but the king was never the most important. The king administered the nation, made sure defenses happened, made sure the taxes took place. He was the main administrator, but he wasn't the most powerful. Then we kind of moved to the priest. Well, the priest must have been the one. He's in charge of the temple. He's got a direct access to God. And no, the priest brought the concerns of the people to God. He administered their sacrifices. He took care of the temple, but he was not the most important figure in Israel. The most powerful figure was the prophet, because all the priests, all the kings, and all the people submitted to the word of the prophet, because the word of the prophet was the word of the Lord. And God spoke to the people through the prophet, while the people spoke to God through the priest. And so Hosea is not just like me, a pastor in a town. Hosea is an authority figure standing on behalf of his God to the community around him. And if you're a young Hosea and you get the call to be a prophet, there's some excitement in that. There's some joy. God is going to use me. God is going to speak to his people through me. God's got great plans for my future. But then he's placed in that northern kingdom. The northern kingdom, the reason they split was because Solomon's son, Rehoboam, turned out to be a very mean, very selfish, very ungodly figure for the nation. And when he imposed some rules on the people of Israel came to him and said, hey, your father was a great man. The rules that you're putting on us, they're crushing us. Would you take the burden off our shoulders, King Rehoboam? So Rehoboam went to his father's advisors, and they said, well, if you want to get in good with the people, if you want to be a popular king, you should lift those burdens. The people will embrace you and bless you forever. But then Rehoboam goes to his young frat brothers And they knew nothing about the word of the Lord. They knew nothing about Solomon's wise ways. He goes to his young advisors, and they say, I tell you what, Rehoboam, you tell these people that your finger is larger than your father's thigh, which is a Hebrew euphemism for a very nasty, mean, cruel, braggart thing to say. That I will never let the people tell me what to do. So you should double the burden on the people. Make them submit. So Rehoboam listens to the young advisors. And so 10 tribes respond to that and say, we will no longer serve you. You are no longer our king. God comes and God establishes a line of kings in the northern kingdom. The first king was Jeroboam. Jeroboam, who God had spoken to through a prophet, had been promised great blessing and a continuing dynasty in the north if he would follow the Lord. But Jeroboam doesn't follow the Lord, and it's hard to wrap my mind around. But the king of Israel, the northern tribes, one of the very first things that he does is he builds 2 golden calves made for the people to worship in the northern kingdom. And he made priests and celebrations for them and established a secondary temple. All of it in complete defile of what the Lord had given him. And right from the start, the northern kingdom goes into this turbulent descent into the abyss. They completely forget about the Lord their God. They worship false gods and idols and set up their own worship system. Right from the get-go, the northern kingdom was in a mess. And I imagine Hosea saying, if I have to choose, Lord, the northern kingdom or the southern kingdom, I would really like ministry in the southern kingdom. But the Lord gives them the northern kingdom that's a complete mess and says, no, you're going to minister to these people who need your voice. So Hosea is the representative of the Lord in that day. And then he gets the most unenviable commission by Yahweh to live his life as an ongoing visual aid of Yahweh's relationship with Israel. Verse 2. When the Lord began to speak through Hosea, the Lord said to him, Go, take to yourself an adulterous wife and children of unfaithfulness, because the land is guilty of the vilest adultery in departing from the Lord. The New American Standard says it this way. Go take to yourself a wife of harlotry and have children of harlotry. For the land commits flagrant harlotry, forsaking the Lord. Can I just tell you, I've never once even thought of praying that for my son, Ethan. Because no good father would ever desire that for their son, right? In fact, we try to put good guardrails up and good boundaries up so that you meet the right woman, you have good character assessment happening, that physical relationship and sex is not going to be the decision making. Let's find someone whose heart is following the Lord. Let's have you follow Jesus so someone is attracted to you who's following Jesus. I mean, we have much better guidelines than God gives to Hosea. Instead, his instructions to his prophet is, I want Israel to see what it's like to be married to them. Go down to the local brothel and find a prostitute and marry her. The local holy man, who is the key figure in Israel, can you imagine the scene? That morning, after he wrestles with God, I would think, for some amount of time, he finally gives in to God's commands. He leaves his door. An Israelite town, like where Hosea lived, I don't know, maybe 200-300 people. It's a couple hundred people. Everybody knew each other. And the local holy man walks out of his door and he starts heading down, and then he takes a left where he should be taking a right. And people would have seen, hey, where's Hosea going? And then he gets closer. And people begin to take note. No. Yes. Look. And he goes right up to the house of harlotry. Maybe it's a brothel. I don't know what it looked like. But it's where women of ill repute would have hung out. It's the old red light districts. Hosea goes right in there. Can you imagine the tabloids the next day? Can you imagine the posts, the blogs, the whispers in town? Hosea is defiling himself. Hosea is going into that part of town just on the trip alone, but then he brings back a wife. Verse 3. So he married Gomer, daughter of Diblaim, and she conceived and bore him a son. But just for a moment, forget about what everyone's saying about Hosea. Where's Hosea's emotions in this? What are you feeling? If this is your call from the Lord. I get one shot at marriage, right? Nobody gets married to get divorced. That's a phrase that we all have. Hosea has one shot at marriage. He's always dreamed about something, and this wasn't it. And yet Hosea shows up. I don't know how he chose, but he chooses a woman named Gomer, and then he marries her. And they get married. What are the emotions swirling around his soul? Here's one thing. He has now become the husband of a woman he knew had been available to his neighbors for a price. And right from the start of Hosea's story, it grates on your soul, right? There's this feeling that we don't like when we begin to put ourselves in Hosea's shoes. Right from the beginning of this book, right through the end, that same feeling is there, which is exactly why God had Hosea live the picture of his relationship with Israel out. Because there's a great connection in here. But flip just for a moment into Gomer's perspective, okay? I don't know, maybe Gomer is 20 years old. Maybe she's 19. Who knows? She's probably fairly young. And I know not a single 10-year-old in any culture or era that wakes up thinking, by the time I'm 20, I want to be a prostitute. There's not a single young woman in any era, in any culture, that aims for that life. Gomer certainly, as a little girl, never wanted to be in that place. I've never met a young woman hoping to be labeled a tramp. And I don't know Gomer's backstory. We just know the name of her father. But man, there must have been some gaping pain, right? I wonder what kind of agony Gomer suffered in her childhood that set her on this road. Some terrible part of her family story that left this little girl, now a young woman, in a very terrible place. And in Israel's culture, we would say Gomer had no household to belong to. Gomer had no Beit Ab, no father's household. Gomer had no loving place within which she could be cherished and loved and nurtured. Gomer was on her own. And this is how she made ends meet. Her trouble is that this would be an ongoing pain in life because no one will marry a woman with her kind of sexual past. So she has no husband to look forward to. She has no future household that she can imagine on what it would be like to be loved and cherished and nurtured and protected. And if she did have children one day, those children would be shunned by her community. This is Gomer's fate. This is what she woke up that morning knowing to be true. And then the local holy man shows up on the front door and says, Gomer, I choose you. to be my wife. Hosea, a man of some stature and some means, asks her to be his wife. And imagine the confusion for Gomer. The confusion in that moment. The reversals in her life that would have been happening. She's brought for the first time into a household, and then she has 3 children. A woman with a past, she now has a future. And this whole scene and how it grates on us and we wonder, the whole scene captures, I think, what it's like for God and His people, at least in part. Because the heartbreaking drama unfolds in a terrible way. Chapter 3, verse 1. So this has gotten very personal for Hosea. If you notice, the pronouns change here. It's first-person pronouns. Hosea is now writing about himself and his experience. Verse 1, the Lord said to me, "Go, show your love to your wife again, though she is loved by another and is an adulteress. Love her as the Lord loves the Israelites, though they turn to other gods and love the sacred raisin cakes." Just for a little lightheartedness, at least it's biblical that we don't need to send fruitcake at Christmas. We don't need to eat fruitcake at Christmas. Raisin cakes apparently were some kind of religious food that were offered maybe for fertility to other idols, which is what God is referring to here. There's a small victory in that. But Gomer's broken soul isn't quite so easily fixed. She's a woman, guys, who's gone from nothing to having everything, and yet she repeats her pattern and she repeats her life once again, and she cheats on Hosea and she runs with another man. Imagine Hosea's anger, his frustration, his humiliation. His wife, who he rescued from a life of harlotry, is cheating on him. And in her mind, the life of sleeping around is superior to life as his wife. And in between those dots, something has happened to Gomer, where the verbiage in chapter 3 is Gomer is up on the auction blocks. She's not only run off with someone else, she's gotten herself into deep trouble where now there's someone that is selling Gomer to the highest bidder on the auction block. She's at the city gate about to be sold off. How deep the betrayal. Like your wife keeping pictures of her ex-boyfriend. Or the betrayal when your wife is typically not dolled up, dresses frumpy, and all of a sudden is all perfumed up and looking great, but it's not for you. That betrayal in that moment is what Hosea is feeling, because it's what God wants us to know He feels as He's married to His bride, His people, the church. And yet the word comes. Go, love her again. Hosea, I know you're devastated. Hosea, I know you want to run the other way. Trust me, I know it. But go and buy your wife back. Go and love her once again. So Hosea takes a second, even deeper, dreaded trip. In public, at the city gate, Hosea goes to find the wife to whom he had given a home, to whom he had given children, to whom he had given his bed, probably to whom he had given his heart. And in the presence of his neighbors, he's bidding on the mother of his children, his wife. 15 shekels of silver and a homer and a half of barley for Gomer. Verse 2. So I bought her for 15 shekels of silver and about a homer and a lethek of barley. You know what this is? This is redemption. This is the cost of redemption. And this story of Hosea and Gomer is the story of God's redemption with you and I. This is the narrative of what redemption looks like for God. For God is long-suffering with His people. And God is forever faithful to His covenant even when we are faithless. He's long-suffering with His people, His bride, with me, with you. Not because we're worth it, but because He is love. So to the cross, Jesus goes to give His life for us, to redeem sinners and adulterers and traitors and idol worshippers and drunkens and gluttons and men who are searching for significance in all the wrong places, and women who are finding their identity and security in lies, and folks whose sexual identity is confused and messy, and professors and businessmen, and stay-at-home moms, and students who put their best foot forward, but are a wreck inside once again. And some of us know that feeling of following Jesus and then turning elsewhere to other gods, other idols for our happiness or satisfaction. And we find ourselves, again, after promising we wouldn't, choosing sin and choosing any way but God's way, even after we've been saved or redeemed. And the guilt or the shame that you have in those moments, the guilt and the shame that crowd you in, that block you off from any joy, that block you off from any intimacy with your Father, with your God. You're very familiar, we're very familiar with those emotions. We want to hide. And we open ourselves up to the lie that we don't belong. Because the accusations fly, right? The accusations come barreling in. See, you never were part of His family. See, you never really did love Jesus. See, you don't really belong to your Father's house. And we begin to listen to the lies. And then, like Gomer, we see Jesus coming to the city gates, just as the auctioneer is closing a deal on our weak and fragile soul. We see our Redeemer walking down the road. 15 shekels of silver and a homer and a half of barley for Gomer. And our Redeemer screaming out at the auction, my life for His. My life for hers. You are redeemed and restored and invited into your Father's household, His Beit Ab, because your Redeemer, the patriarch of your clan, has come for you. Even after we failed again. Even after we betrayed once again. Your Redeemer is forever faithful to His covenant with you. And so His kids, His family, His bride, they celebrate when they see Him coming. Because He is a good Redeemer. He is a good rescuer for people in need. We're going to invite you up to the table. Chris and Gabby and Brian will lead us in some worship. As we come to the table, I've said this various weeks, we come to the table as we travel home, which is what this little display behind me is. We're all kind of on the outside looking in. We're hopeful that our visuals this Lent is creating just enough of that stir in our souls that I don't want to be outside. I want to be inside the home. I want to be in a place where I belong. I want to be in a place where I'm loved, where I'm embraced and forgiven and restored. And as we come to the table, this table is the invitation for you to come and dine with your Redeemer and feast with the King and to eat his body and his blood represented here, which is the cost of redemption for you, that you would belong in the home. And so we'll invite you to come home to the meal, to communion.